Let's just dive right into one of the most incredible stories ever told. Seriously, it's got everything. A decision that makes no sense, a family shattered by grief, and a miracle so huge, so undeniable, it literally got a man killed. This isn't just about a resurrection, it's the story of the man who died twice.
And it all starts with this totally cryptic line from Jesus in verse 4. Imagine this. He gets the news that his dear friend is literally on his deathbed, and this is his response. At the time, it makes zero sense, but this one sentence, it's the key to the entire story. A man is dying, and Jesus' first move is to wait. Let's find out why.
So, our story doesn't kick off with a big, flashy miracle. No, it starts with a mystery, a painful, confusing delay that's going to test the faith of every single person involved.
Okay, so verse 1 sets the scene. We're in a little town called Bethany, and you need to picture this specific house, home to a man named Lazarus and his two sisters, Martha and Mary. Verse 2 just gives us a quick but really important detail. This Mary, she's the same one who will later anoint Jesus' feet with that super expensive perfume. Then, in verse 3, the action starts. A messenger, probably out of breath, finds Jesus and delivers this urgent, personal plea. Lord, the one you love is sick.
And this is where this story gets, well, kind of weird. Verse 5 makes it absolutely crystal clear. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. You'd expect him to drop everything, right? But then verse 6 hits us with the baffling part. Because he loved them, he stayed right where he was for 2 more days. Just picture a calendar, 2 full days being crossed off while hope is just draining away back in Bethany. Finally, in verse 7, after that agonizing wait, Jesus just turns to his disciples and says, "Let us go back to Judea."
So in verse 8, the disciples, they immediately panic. You can just see their wide eyes as they say, "Rabbi, are you serious? Just a little while ago, the people there tried to stone you, and you're going back?" In verses 9 and 10, Jesus gives this sort of cryptic answer about walking in the light, basically saying he's on a divine schedule. And then in verse 11, he just adds to the confusion with this weird metaphor. Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up.
Well, in verse 12, the disciples just completely miss the metaphor. You can almost see their relieved smile as they go, "Oh, sleep, great, if he's sleeping, he'll get better." So in verse 14, Jesus has to be brutally direct. Imagine him just stopping, looking them right in the eyes and saying it plainly, "Lazarus is dead." And then in verse 15, he says something that must have sounded just wild. "And for your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe." Verse 16 kind of shows us where their heads are at. Thomas, ever the realist, just grimly says to the others, "Well, let's go too, so we can die with him." He's only seeing the danger, not the miracle.
So the waiting is finally over. Jesus is on his way to Bethany, but he is walking straight into a scene of just raw, unfiltered grief. Grief that, let's be honest, his own delay seems to have caused.
In verse 17, Jesus shows up and gets the news. Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, 4 days is a big deal. In that culture, many believe the soul lingered near the body for 3 days. Day 4 meant it was over. All hope was gone. Verses 18 and 19 paint the picture. The house is packed with mourners. Then in verse 20, we see 2 totally different ways of handling grief. Martha, always the woman of action, hears Jesus is coming and runs out to meet him. Mary, on the other hand, just stays in the house, completely overcome.
Verse 21. Wow. Martha confronts him, and you can just hear it in her voice, this mix of incredible faith and just heart-shattering pain. But then look at verse 22. She adds, "But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Her faith has been wounded, for sure, but it's not dead. So when Jesus tells her in verse 23 that her brother will rise again, she agrees in verse 24, but she's thinking of some far-off end-of-time resurrection.
And this is the turning point of the whole story. In verses 25 and 26, Jesus just reframes everything. He says, "I am the resurrection and the life." He's not talking about something that will happen someday. He's talking about a present reality. He is resurrection. Then he looks right at her and asks the most important question, "Do you believe this?" And in verse 27, she gives this incredible statement affirming her faith in him.
Okay, so now it's Mary's turn. In verses 28 through 31, Martha quietly goes and gets her, and Mary rushes out to Jesus. Then in verse 32, she finally reaches him, but she doesn't debate theology. She doesn't ask questions. She just falls at his feet, weeping, and says the exact same words as her sister. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." The same sentence, but this time is delivered with the full weight of just complete and utter devastation.
In verse 33, when Jesus sees her and everyone else weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. Now, the original language here is powerful. It's not just sadness. It's more like a deep, visceral anger, almost a rage against death itself. He asks in verse 34, "Where have you laid him?" And then we get to verse 35, the shortest and maybe the most powerful verse in the entire Bible. Jesus wept. His tears totally split the crowd. In verse 36, you've got one group, and they see it as proof of his love. See how he loved him. But in verse 37, you've got the cynics, and their words are kind of like a backhanded compliment full of doubt. They're muttering, "Yeah, okay, this is the guy who healed a blind man. Couldn't he have bothered to keep his own friend from dying?" The questions, the grief, the doubt, it has all been leading to this moment. Jesus, still deeply moved, arrives at the tomb. This is it. The moment of truth has arrived. So in verse 38, Jesus comes to the tomb. It's a cave with a huge stone rolled in front of it. And in verse 39, he gives a simple, powerful command, "Take away the stone." And practical Martha just panics. She's trying to protect him from the grim reality of it all. "Lord," she objects, "by this time there is a stench, for he has been dead 4 days." She is grounding everybody in the hard, physical, awful reality of decay. In verse 40, Jesus just gently reminds her, "Didn't I tell you that if you believe you will see the glory of God?" So they roll the stone away. In verses 41 and 42, Jesus looks up to heaven and offers a prayer. But it's not a prayer asking for power, it's a prayer of thanks for the power he already has, spoken so the crowd can hear. Then, in verse 43, with a voice of absolute, world-changing authority, he cries out, "Lazarus, come forth!"
And then verse 44, the stunning, unbelievable climax, a figure completely wrapped from head to toe in burial cloths just shuffles out of the darkness of the tomb and into the light. The crowd is just frozen in shock, in awe, in terror, and Jesus gives one last simple command: loose him and let him go.
Now you'd think seeing a man walk out of his own grave after 4 days, you'd think that would unite everybody in belief, right? But nope, that's not what happened. The miracle that brought one man back to life would end up dividing everyone else.
The miracle causes this immediate, stark division. It's like a line was drawn in the sand. In verse 45, for many people, this was it. This was undeniable proof, and they believed. But in verse 46, for others, this wasn't a reason for faith, it was a reason for fear. A threat so big they immediately ran to tell the religious authorities what had happened.
And this brings us to the final, darkest, and most ironic twist in the entire story. The ultimate act of giving life becomes the very reason the authorities decide that Jesus has to die.
So in verse 47, the religious leaders call an emergency meeting of the council. They're in a full-blown panic. And in verse 48, we hear their real fear. It's not religious, it's political. They're saying, look, if everyone starts following this man, we're going to lose control, and the Romans will come and crush us all.
Then, in verses 49 and 50, the high priest, a guy named Caiaphas, steps in with some cold, hard political logic. He basically says it is expedient, it's convenient and practical for one man to die for the people, rather than have the whole nation get destroyed. And the author, John, points out the incredible irony in verses 51 and 52. Caiaphas had no idea he was actually prophesying the entire purpose of Jesus' death.
And so in verse 53, the decision was made. It was done. From that day on, it became an official plot. Verse 54 tells us Jesus had to go into hiding because, as we see in verses 55 through 57, the authorities put out what was essentially an arrest warrant. If you see Jesus, you are required to report him.
So the story of Lazarus, it's the story of Jesus' greatest miracle before his own resurrection. It was an undeniable public display of his power over the grave. But in doing so, he forced the hand of his enemies. He turned their simmering fear into a fatal plot. The incredible act of giving life directly led to his own death.